We are all aware of the technology advances in hearing aids. Now the hearing care market is seeking to expand its ecosystem of service delivery options in this space. Here with me today on This Week in Hearing is Dr. David Akbari, Senior Medical Science, Clinical and Regulatory Affairs Liaison at Intricon Micromedical Technology. Welcome, David, and would you kindly share your background with our viewership?
Hello, Amin. It's great to be with you. So my background is I'm an audiologist, and I got the AUD and MA degrees at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. But my background in this really started at Berklee College of Music, where I did my undergrad, with a specific focus on music synthesis. So I looked a lot at software development and more specifically haptic interfaces for musical expression, which was something that at the time I had no idea it would lead me to audiology, but here I am.
Oh, that's really, really cool. So Intricon Corporation, we've heard this name several times with some of the products and interfaces that you all have had with product development. Can you tell us a little bit about the company?
Sure. So Intricon Corporation's really been making many high quality regulated medical devices for 45 years. So the company started in 1977. And Intricon really focuses a lot on the medical side with continuous glucose monitors, interventional catheters, electromagnetic tip location and surgical navigation, all sorts of microelectronics assemblies. But Intricon itself started as a hearing aid company, making components, trimmers at that time. These days, of course, hearing aids have advanced a lot. And so Intricon has also advanced with the addition of ultra low power wireless technologies in hearing aids, digital signal processing, and generally, Intricon is a joint development manufacturing company for body-worn medical devices. So it's not just a hearing aid company, and actually was named Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal 2022 Manufacturer of the Year.
Oh, congratulations. That's really, really cool. It's almost a one-stop shop. It's kind of the Best Buy, if you will, for these kind of micro electronic tools.
Sure.
Okay, so let's start out before we dive into this really cool study that was the results were released. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the industry. And we know that the penetration rate isn't where we want it to be. And we know that that's caused by various aspects. And so we've had all these advances in technology, and we've all these legislative reforms that are now leading to accessibility and service delivery. So let's talk a little bit about this and then move into this self-fitting component that you all have released.
Sure. So, with regard to low penetration rates caused by various aspects, at the biggest level of this, really it's about access and affordability. And so the United States is a very big place. And so when we think about audiology, you tend to think about a very medical environment with calibrated equipment, skilled licensed professionals. It's really a white coat type of experience. But many people in the United States live in areas that are quite remote, and they don't have access to that type of calibrated equipment, professional skill sets, or any of those tools. So former CEO and board director Mark Gorder really saw a trend early on and commissioned a lot of research to look at why there were problems with penetration caused by various aspects, including in the mid part of the last decade, in the mid 2010s, we were at the first new entrant into the NHS in 35 years, which is a socialized healthcare system. And what I found really interesting working on that myself was that even in the UK model, the penetration rates aren't what people would perhaps want them to be. And if you really peel back the onion in terms of consumer satisfaction, one trend that emerged, at least in my view, was that the number one reason people want hearing aids is also the number one reason they're dissatisfied, which is hearing and background noise. So it's not necessarily one thing. It's a combination of things, because it's the product a little bit where we're trying to make everything louder to be able to hear in background noise. So you're making the noise louder too, but it's also about our whole paradigm with this. And so I think there are some opportunities. Now, I'm not saying that the paradigm itself doesn't work. It works fantastic. But I think it's sort of this Pareto principle where you do the tremendous amount of work in the sort of the last percentage points. And so for this particular aspect and market segment, the low penetration rates really can boil down to, and I think the best words to use are access and affordability. And they can mean a variety of different things.
Yeah, 100%. And you talked about, the white coat piece and the accessibility. And that's now allowing the profession and the industry to move into this do-it-yourself, this direct-to-consumer model. And so, as we're moving into this, there's again an improvement in technology in that area. And then there's also an advancement in the service delivery of these things. And so you guys have a self-fitting product that's available that you studied just recently. Let's dive into that a little bit.
Sure. So the product itself is called Sentibo, and the name Sentibo itself is Latin, and it means to understand rather than just to hear. And actually, Sentibo today is not for sale in the United States. We're still in the process of going through that regulatory approval, but it is commercially available today in Germany. So it's sold in Europe. And it's really the concept is based on the idea of like tinnitus retraining therapy, or something where you've got this excitation and relaxation idea. And in the German model, it is actually something that's offered in the audiologist office. So as much as we're looking at its potential in the United States for this future not yet defined OTC, that in fact, actually in Germany today, it's been more used commercially within the audiologist practice. And cheekily, it's kind of the spouse of the person coming in for a hearing test. They're the ones who are curious and they want to try it. It's sort of think of a kiosk in Germany, and they're standing there sort of poking buttons and messing around because they're curious about their hearing. And you can kind of see that little seed or that sprout start to emerge, that once people get a taste, they're going to be more likely to pursue hearing as a holistic life goal.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So this product that is dispensed in the German market, is it does it have an interface? Does it have a smartphone interface, or is it just a device that's worn on the ear? Can you describe that a little bit more, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So it does use, as I understand, any combination of the iOS platforms in Germany. So you have iPads, iPhones, iPod Touch. It just generally works on iOS. But if you think about it, it's mostly just a vehicle. It's a common ecosystem that's fairly standardized, and it's used in that way. Certainly, you could make it something that you drive from the hearing aid itself, but in this particular area, when we start talking about improvements in the technology, really that human factors engineering piece ends up being a big part of it.
Yeah, 100%. And if you look at the literature, we've had some mixed results where in some studies, the participants have been successful with these tools, and in others that they haven't. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that relates to your product and the study that you all designed?
Sure. So there have been a lot of articles that have looked at self-fitting, the efficacy, and of course, safety. Just to preface these remarks, the study that we did really was done with the explicit intent of supporting the regulatory filing. So, a lot of these are really intended to advance the academic understanding of where we're at as a profession, as a field. And so you do see a lot of those articles, like I think Larry Humes and colleagues did a nice article where they looked at audiology best practices versus a consumer decides versus a placebo paradigm. And what you find there is kind of that the consumer decides was comparable. You can't really make claims about either group, but it wasn't horribly bad. It wasn't so bad about it. Everybody knows about the prominent ones in the industry, so I won't necessarily name those. But one of the key outcomes of some of that research is this idea of a dimension-reduced controller. This idea that in order to maximize the haptic interface, or the interface with the human being, is that it's all about the simplicity, but it embeds this level of complexity. So when we say dimension-reduced controller, imagine having just one scroll wheel that controls a plurality of compression, band equalization, output limiting, and so on and so forth. You're able to customize your experience with simplicity, almost not unlike the Apple single push button that does so many different things. Fingerprint sensor, you press it in, a double press and hold, and so on and so forth. There's all these different haptic interactions you can have. And so one of the research, when they're looking at that, a lot of it's focused on the hearing attributes, or the what's actually produced to the ear canal. But arguably in this particular area, the haptic interface is as important or more important in terms of user acceptance and the accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity of these results.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I would also add to that there's a health literacy piece that goes with this too. In other words, if you don't give the right labeling or the right instructions, then you might come out with a different outcome than what was intended for that particular component.
Absolutely. And perhaps that's one of the biggest potential outcomes of the OTC legislation, no matter what ends up in the final rule, is that it gets people thinking about their hearing as an active sense, as something that stays with them in their whole lives and something that they can work to actually improve. I mean, think of the idea of hearing or awareness of sounds versus listening, like active listening and focused attention. So you have things like selective auditory attention and other executive function type things that relate to auditory cognition. And we're just sort of at the precipice of that wealth of literature now, where people are starting to think about this. But when you talk about health literacy and labeling, people just able to get a taste is going to really improve the public awareness of what we do as audiologists and allied professions.
So as we're talking about health literacy and labeling, I think this is an area that has a prime opportunity for emerging research in our area. And I think we will start to see some of this information come to the forefront and really help not only the provider, but also the patient when it comes to this affordability, accessibility, and then hopefully the adoption of these tools that are going to be available for people who are struggling to hear in these different environments. So I think that's going to be really, really important and critical. So there was a press release that came out about a week or so ago, and you all had collaborated with another third party and done a study. And can we talk a little bit about what that study was and some of the methodologies and maybe some of the findings from that?
Sure, absolutely. So we did commission, as I mentioned, the self-fitting study. So what we wanted to do was validate labeling, human factors attributes, as well as a potential software option that we intend to submit for regulatory approval. So this, or regulatory clearance, excuse me. And so the issue with this right now is that before we've actually achieved that regulatory clearance milestone. So I'll talk generally about it to the extent I can. And so we did collaborate with a contract clinical research organization called Amplify Labs. And it's a separate entity among that business group, but they are seasoned professional audiologists, really great to work with. I have no limit to the good things I'll say about working with them. And they've really identified the need to service this particular segment, that they know manufacturers are going to have to go through this rigorous evaluation, perhaps in the future. But what we did in terms of our study was the main focus at the highest level was we wanted to show non-inferiority. That was the key outcome, is the design that we did really focused on comparing outcomes of two different fitting approaches. So our, as in Intricon's professional fit approach, with the proposed Sentibo self-fit approach. And so itself, backing up a little bit with Sentibo, it's based on a psychoacoustic audibility model. And so a lot of the debate around OTC and about hearing aids really focuses on the National Acoustics Laboratory's nonlinear revision 2 fitting rationale. And it's a great fitting rationale. It's been used, since 2011 or whatever. And people use it. It's kind of an industry standard for audiologists. But we wanted to challenge that a little bit in this market segment and really look at some of the key differences. And so probably the biggest key difference in the audibility model is that we're using the sort of concept of equal loudness contours. And so what that means, and some people call them Fletcher-Munson curves. Others have referred to them as Robinson and Dadson curves, researchers in the 30s and 50s who have looked at this. Now we call it ISO 226, so it is standardized. And, for reference, this ISO 226 standard, the 40 phone level is the basis for A weighting when we start to look at filter attenuation characteristics. So there is precedent a little bit to look at phone levels as it relates to psychoacoustics and perception. What we were interested in is looking at how this could be affected by hearing loss when you give people the control themselves. The other key piece to this is it's based on the science of the Bark scale. So it's sort of this musical organization, logarithmic organization, as opposed to frequency in hertz when we look at the processing in the algorithm. But the design of this study was we wanted to do this to show non-inferiority of satisfaction and fitting process outcomes in a multi-center, prospective, interventional, randomized, single-blind, parallel group design. So that's what we did. So we didn't do a crossover. We did a parallel groups design. It was randomized, single-blind, and that's because even though we're studying this today, we are operating under the current regulatory framework. So OTC does not exist yet, and it will not exist until the final rule is issued. So we do have to kind of be cognizant of that. Ideally, we'd like to do double blind, of course, to have a stronger study. But and then, of course, it was randomized, and then we did an intervention both for the professional fitting as well as the self-fitting. And so one of the key attributes that we were looking at, in addition to the findings about the self-fitting and what goes into the ear canal, is also really we spent a lot of time and effort looking at the usability and human factors piece of this. So unboxing, is the labeling understandable? Is it effective? And I think to the extent that in OTC, everybody's relying on labeling as a key control point, you're going to see a lot of emphasis put on that going forward, I think, is where, labeling and validation of the consumer experience as they get the product. And the other piece is, when you look at OTC hearing aids, really, it's not about just selling a product on a peg. It's a whole process. And that's what we were kind of trying to look at here in terms of how we set up the study. Is we wanted to kind of set it up to look at an ecosystem of care, more so than just here's the product and how did you do?
Yeah, that's really, excuse me, that's really, really interesting. And so you talk about this, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. You talk about the psychoacoustic model and how it differs from the now acoustic model. Can you, just for our audience who may not know what those differences are between those two, just give us a short summary of why they're different?
Yeah, sure. So the idea with NAL, NL2 is that you use the results of a diagnostic hearing test. So when you have the audiogram, you measure the audiogram, you have the softest sound that you're able to hear. You get in each ear specific degree, type, and configuration of hearing loss. So you've got bone conduction thresholds, you've got air conduction thresholds, and you just put those into the NAL, NL2 algorithm, and it gives you prescribed output, which we call our prescription. And so it's essentially, if you think about it, we're trying to manage the loudness growth in the impaired ear, whether that's sensory hearing loss or conductive or mixed hearing loss. The difference with Sentibo is that we're not claiming at all that this is any type of a hearing test. Really, that we're trying to say, if you, for example, are listening to beeps, and then ultimately when you wear hearing aids, you're trying to listen to sounds in the world. That's kind of an abstraction, if you think about it, is that we're putting these results to tones, very specific tones, into an algorithm, and then we're predicting. We're essentially guessing, in other words. We're making a good guess. Don't get me wrong. It's an educated guess. But ultimately, it is a guess because we simply don't possess the ears of the person we're trying to treat. And so Sentibo is a little bit different because we give the onus back to the person. And so the audibility model is really based on the concept of multiple environment listening utility. So how can you take this product and listen to it in a number of different environments in order to maximize your own satisfaction? And it's a little bit different because, for example, we're not making a diagnostic assessment. This is not a hearing test. We're also focused really on the end goal. So imagine a world where you simply go up to your self-fitting solution, you put your hearing aids on, much like you would put on glasses that you'd find at the supermarket, and then you addition it, you evaluate it in that sense. And that's more where we're approaching this, as opposed to this NL2 model, which ends up being back into from making decisions about surgery or a very medical focused form of audiology.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So in order to do this, it sounds like you would have to have some presets. You would have to have certain differences in your electroacoustics, just like you would with eyeglasses, right? You've got your 1 and your 1.5s and your 2s. You would have those presets, and people could put these devices on and then listen to that. Am I understanding that correctly? Yeah,
that's one way to do it. That is one way to do it. There are a variety of different ways to do it. And if you look at the proposed FDA regulation, they talk about tools, tests, and software. And this is kind of an example of that quantity. And if you notice how they parse it, it's all three together. It's tools, tests, and software. It's not tools, and then they enumerate it, tests, and they enumerate it. It's all three. And so that is an example. And it's in fact an example the FDA has used when they've described this. There are a number of ways that this could manifest itself, but certainly that's a great way to characterize it.
Okay, great. Yeah, just again for clarity for individuals. And so you have this Sentibo device. Did you compare it to another device?
No, so we just compared it to our individual devices because when you start adding the variability of different components and different fitting methodologies and different rationales. Now, keep in mind, when you put something into NAL, NL2, there's all kinds of specific implementation details that manifest themselves when you actually go into the hearing aid level. So the different components that you select that are in the hearing aid, the plastics that are used, the propensity for resonance phenomena to exist in the hearing aid that results in oscillatory feedback, for example. So these are things that complicate it, but certainly that could be an area of interest in future research.
Oh, that's interesting. So you took your product and you found that the self-programming on average came up with more improved satisfaction. You had sound quality improvements. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's from the press release.
Yeah, sure. So I think when we looked at the satisfaction endpoint, so just to talk about the study design a little bit, the primary endpoints that we looked at we were looking actually for non-inferiority. That's what we set out to do, is to show that it's not worse than. The self-fitting is not worse than our ProFit on the same device, because we're trying to kind of control for all those variables that could add variability. And what we actually found was that mean satisfaction for the primary endpoints for self-fit was greater than the ProFit, and actually there was less variability. And so my explanation for that is that when you give the person the control in their hands and they're able to decide what sounds right for them in that environment, they're able to hone in on something they're reasonably agreeable to, is my explanation for that.
That's interesting. And if you think about today's technology, right? So take a smartphone and you're in an environment where you're listening through your headphones. It's no different than you going in and changing maybe the filter setting on your music, or taking your headphones in on my phone, and maybe I'm a little more of an audiophile. I have a little filter setting. I can go in and change it to reduce the lows and maybe increase the highs, so that if I'm streaming a call or something, I'm not getting the upward spread of masking. So is that kind of the tone that we're talking about here?
Absolutely. And it's like, it really comes back to this idea of a dimension reduced controller. And if you think about the example you gave, think of what would a tone control mean, right? Is it a bandpass filter that you're adjusting the cutoff frequency? Is it you're making a filter wider or smaller with Q, which is an inverse proportion of bandwidth, and so on and so forth? I mean, it's a great way to look at this.
Yeah, and as we were talking about the health literacy, one of my frustrations when I was a clinician was we never knew what the device was actually doing. And I'm hoping, as we're talking about health literacy and these patients now are getting these tools, that we're going to be able to say that this is a tone control, and if you do this, this is going to be the outcome. And so do you foresee potentially, and again, we don't know, that might potentially be some of the health literacy that could come out?
Absolutely. In fact, to the extent that people are given an impetus to be interested in what their hearing aids are doing or their technology is doing, it really positions audiologists as leading advocates for this. Because imagine offering a service where in your clinic you can have people come in and they're just interested in learning more, and it's a fee-for-service type thing that no one's stopping you from measuring real on this, for example, and being able to explain how it's working or to help them hone in on things that they could need help with. So I think what's going to happen ideally coming out of all this, both research and public policy, is that people will have an increased level of health literacy such that once they get a taste, it'll spur some curiosity for them.
Well, David, one of the things that I've argued for, and you just brought this up, was how did this benefit the provider? And I think as people start to think about what's coming next, they're going to have to change their service delivery model. And it's going to vary depending on social determinants of health and things that are available in the environments and what have you. And for some individuals, they're going to need that extra help. And if there's a way to set up, and I'm going to use Apple as an example, where you go in and you've got the folks that are at the counter, and you're able then to ask a question, and they're able to walk you through the usage of that particular tool. But in this case, because you're a healthcare provider, you could potentially charge for it. That is a service delivery model that could potentially assist the healthcare provider as we move into this new marketplace. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things I like to describe about this is if you think about the history, you look at the latter part of the last century, some people actually saw hearing aids, the act of dispensing hearing aids, as unethical, that we were sort of diagnostic technicians as audiologists, and to some extent it was unethical to also dispense the hearing aids. I believe that we're in a similar historic moment at this time, with the advent of OTC hearing aids and consumers really taking the onus on themselves. Now, if you think about the current model where we use, it's unfortunate, but it's the reality that people, when they come into your clinic, they sort of sometimes will have the sense that, well, you're broken. We need to fix you. There's something wrong with you. You know, your hearing is broken and so on and so forth. Whereas one of the things we're finding in some of this research we're looking at is that if you give the power back to them and you say, well, instead of that you're broken, how about this could help you? Here's a tool that can help. And then they're able to use it as much or as little as they want. It gives them a taste, and they're more likely to be agreeable to what we've already established over many years as audiology service delivery. If you think about it, this could represent a tremendous opportunity for audiology as a profession and really elevate audiologists to a true, as we are already, a true doctoring profession, but even solidify that even more. You know, you think about something like a dentist where the dental hygienist comes in and does cleans your teeth, and then the doctor will come in and look at your x-rays and so on. I mean, this could be the type of thing you see analogous to OTC hearing aids, where you have someone who's like a blue shirt as a reference to a Best Buy service professional or an audiology assistant or what have you, who's doing some of the non-licensed professional work. And then you come in as that expert provider and really demonstrate the value of your service beyond just the device. So it's an opportunity for audiologists to really decouple ourselves and the value that we provide to the public from just being a salesperson of a device. And that's tremendously powerful in my view.
No, 100%. I agree with you. You know, and we heard it here first. So, David, I'm going to give you credit for this. You know, meeting patients where they are and empowering them is the key to the future of folks adopting this technology and bettering themselves through the help of the service provider. I think that is a very, very powerful message to send to our viewership and as part of our future as we, evolve as a doctoring profession. I think that's a well said statement. I'm going to give you credit for that, my friend.
Oh, well, thank you for that.
So, are there any other things that you can share about the study, or should we move on to, what's coming next?
Yeah, well, I mean, about the study itself, some people had asked about our power level and so on, and number of people.
That's right.
We did exceed. So in other words, in order to demonstrate the non-inferiority hypothesis that we sought to prove, we assumed equal outcomes in both groups, self-fit and pro-fit. And we really wanted a 90% desired power level under a one-sided test with 0.05 alpha, 95% confidence, in other words. And so what that meant is based on the effect size we were expecting and the resolution of our questionnaires, it meant that we needed about 80 people, and we ended up with 92. So we did exceed that 90% power level in this particular sampling distribution. And also, we were talking about dependent variables or some of the outcome measures we use. So we measured subject satisfaction, which where we asked them about sound quality as well as the fitting process. We also measured the AFAB as a secondary outcome, which was the abbreviated profile of hearing aid benefit, pretty standard outcome measure. We also used the speech, spatial, and qualities index, which is the SSQ-12, just 12 questions about speech, spatial, and quality. So can you hear the dog? And it's a 1 to 10 point scale. And of course, what we also wanted to do to really focus on high quality, safe operation of these devices is we measured the results as they would be at the level of the eardrum. So what kind of a sound pressure level were we presenting to people, and was it safe? And we were able to show, I think, the absolute peak output in the use case that we presented it. In other words, we were measuring a maximum power output on the real ear system, I think was 101.3 or something like that. It was, so there's a considerable debate around that maximum output, whatever, and whatever that it lands on, we're hoping that you can just drive a truck through that tolerance from an Intricon perspective. And that's the thing, that's a point I want to make about this, is that these will not be cheap hearing aids that end up as OTC products. I think people have this perception that there are these predatory companies out there who are going to want to just seize the opportunity of OTC hearing aids. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think these are going to be the most premium features. It's going to be high technology. It's going to be stuff that you're going to see premium features in this segment, because as you have self-perceived mild to moderate hearing loss, those are the people that are going to have much higher expectations of the fidelity of the product and anything like that. So I think if a simple way to put this is there's a magnificent diversity in the United States of people. We come in all different shapes and sizes and colors and preferences. Why would we not expect our hearing aids, which become part of us, to be the same?
Another profound statement, David. That's absolutely true, and I've never thought of it in that way, but that is absolutely correct. If you have a mild to moderate hearing loss, your hearing sensitivity is better, so your expectations should obviously be higher. So 100%. That's it's been fascinating so far. So David, for the impaired user, we have all of these advantages for them and these tools that are starting to be created. Do you really, and I know you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to expand on it. Do you really feel like we're going to increase that market penetration rate that we said was low when we first started this conversation?
Yeah, so the market penetration rate is low. And the way I see this is if the legislation isn't opened enough, if there's not enough opportunity to unleash the spirit of American innovation for this, you probably won't see those improvements. Now, I'm optimistic, and it's really been Intricon's position that the final OTC rule should be issued without delay and should be substantively similar to what was in the proposed rule, which would allow companies to provide high quality, highly regulated medical devices that could service currently the or underserved people. And if you think about it, if you look at the aggregate statistics and data, and Intricon's commissioned research about this, just in summary, if you had all the audiology programs who are graduating AUDs in the whole country, and every single one of those students was dispensing hearing aids full time, which we know is not true, it just doesn't happen for whatever reason, you still wouldn't even come close to meeting the needs in the aggregate sense of or underserved Americans. And so what that means is this is coming from the NASEM and PCAS reports. And so I think as long as there's an open enough format, in other words, this OTC hearing aids are not overly restrictive, you will see improvements in that penetration because it's going to be predicated on the ecosystem of care. In other words, it's not just a product on a peg, it's a whole process, things like 24-hour care and support, things that help us as audiologists focus on what we do the best. And then, they say double down on your strengths and outsource your weaknesses. It's kind of a way to look at this. And I think as long as that spirit of American innovation can be unleashed, not overly burdened with the regulations, you will see this market segment flourish. And you'll see a lot of people have tremendous quality improvements in their lives. I think it's, for example, one of the false premises I've heard lately is people assume that OTC hearing aid users will pick OTC hearing aids over the audiologist. Actually, what we're seeing is that they're picking OTC over nothing. And that's one of the problems with this particular market segment is that, as we know, people tend not to seek services for hearing loss when things start to really affect their function. They start to, you start to get this garden variety sloping, high frequency sensory neural hearing loss, and it starts to affect the speech frequencies, then they get the help. Whereas OTC hearing aids, as we've long known from the pediatric world, early detection and intervention is key. So when we can get people interested in this, we can get the health literacy, we can improve the outcomes. And that's really what this is about. This is not about selling hearing aids. It's about improving the public health outcomes, reducing the social isolation that people feel, and just really benefiting the quality of lives, in addition to positioning audiologists as leaders in this space.
David, it has been fabulous having this conversation with you. Have I forgotten anything in this dialogue?
You haven't forgotten anything, but I might add to this that, with the sense that OTC hearing aids are having all this new regulations, I think there's going to be also an increased focus on the prescription hearing aid side as well. So that's another exciting thing coming out of this. And in my current role as chairman of ANSI ASA S3 Working Group 48, which is it controls one of the standards, authors one of the standards, ANSI S322, which is the standard for quality control 2cc coupler in the test box. I think you're going to start to see more focus on that stuff as well. And I think audiologists, whether they're for or against OTC hearing aids, I think you're going to still see, no matter what happens with OTC, an increased focus on medical audiology, which should make many audiologists excited. And I think it's a good outcome eventually for this health literacy improvement we expect as a downstream effect of OTC hearing aids.
The future sure does look bright for our profession. You have been a wealth of information, David, And I hope to get you back on here once maybe the OTC bill has passed and have a conversation about what that's going to look like down the road. So thanks again for your time. Forgive my voice. And I look forward to seeing you again, David.
It was great to be with you. Thank you.